It got me wrong. The color is so hot. I want to go out and cold. She's crazy, absolutely crazy.
Hello, hello.
Hello.
Welcome everyone to the second event of our 45th annual ODU Literary Festival. My name is Molly McCully-Brown. I'm an assistant professor of English and creative nonfiction here at ODU. And it's my honor to be emceeing this evening. Before we get to introducing our wonderful reader, I just want to say a few thank yous. First of all, to Colin Strong and Sarah Glazer and the Arts at ODU, who did so much of the legwork of making this festival and our wonderful publicity happen. To the Office of the Dean and the Office of the President for all their support, financial and logistical, to the wonderful folks at the University Village Bookstore who are here selling books by our author David Wright Faladé this evening, and to my wonderful co-director Trent Wascombe, who I'm going to welcome to the stage to introduce our reader for this evening.
Welcome all of you. I just got to say it again because I'm used to doing it, to the 45th annual Old Dominion University Literary Festival. It is my honor tonight to introduce David Wright Faladé, author of, among other things, the best work of and most moving, rousing, and intense work of what we call historical fiction, but what is just good old-fashioned literary fiction. It's called Black Cloud Rising, and it is the story of one Richard Etheridge, son of an enslaved mother and plantation master father, and his time as a member of what was called the African Brigade. In 1863, composed largely of, quote, sandbankers, mostly formerly enslaved men from the Outer Banks of North Carolina. This brigade was headquartered in Norfolk and officered by, this guy's got quite a bill, so I have to slow up, homeopathic physician, Crimean War veteran, where he served in the Turkish army, an abolitionist, General Edward A. Wilde, who, as a character in this book, earns his surname. I could say a whole bunch about how much this book moved me, lit me up, and made me, most importantly, turn the next page. But I will leave it to your experience, because we have copies here in the University Bookstore, ready to be purchased and ready to be signed by our wonderful guests. But I'll leave you, at least in part, with a quote from one of our great writers of fiction set in the distant past, Charles Fraser, the author of a book called Cold Mountain, some of you might know, who said about Black Cloud Rising, Wright Faladé's richly detailed, grippingly told story breathed life into a revolutionary moment when the U.S. moved a vital step forward toward achieving the ideals we've always proclaimed. And one more from the New York Times Book Review. This book is a straight-up page-turner, and that is, again, absolutely true. But before I talk too much, perhaps, about the book itself, I must say a few words about its author. David Wright Faladé is a professor of English at the University of Illinois, and he is the Mary Ellen von der Hayden Fellow at the New York Public Library's Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers. He's the co-author of the young adult novel Away Running and the nonfiction book Fire on the Beach, recovering the lost story of Richard Etheridge and the PI-owned Lifesavers, which was a New Yorker notable selection and a St. Louis Dispatch Best Book of 2001. David Wright Faladé is the recipient of the Zora Neale Hurston Richard Wright Award, and he's written for The New Yorker, The Village Voice, The Southern Review, Newsday, and many, many more. It is my honor to welcome to the stage David Wright Faladé.
Hear me okay?
Yeah.
Good. Thanks. I'm gonna move this. Thanks for coming out. Thanks, Kent, Molly, for inviting. It's really an honor to be here, and really wonderful introduction. Yeah, sometimes you hear something like that, and you go, that doesn't seem to jive with the person I know. In that same vein, I'm going to read two shortish excerpts tonight. In part because the thing that I enjoy most about these sorts of events is really the conversation that we have, sort of between me and the audience, questions you have, and sort of take it from there. The two excerpts I chose, I was thinking about it, and one of the things that's happened since the book came out in February, one of the things that's happened since the book came out, really well received, which is such a pleasure and an honor. But oftentimes as I hear like when I read the description in the New York Times, it didn't sound like the book I thought I'd written. So I'm going to read a little bit from the book that I thought I'd written, and then a little bit from the book that is, how it's being received, which is to say, Fire on the Beach Black Cloud Rising grew out of Fire on the Beach, my first book. In doing the research for Fire on the Beach, which is a narrative history, it's the story of, I'm going to say some things probably that y'all know living here in Tidewater, Virginia, but 150 years ago, everything travels by water, by and large. So sea lanes are hugely important. And after the Civil War, the United States government starts what was called the United States Life-Saving Service. It's the forerunner of the Coast Guard. And there were about 200 stations along the coast, and they're there basically to safeguard shipping. One of those 200 odd stations was staffed exclusively by blacks. And it was in the Outer Banks, down, whatever that is, 75 miles down the road, or however far that is. So Fire on the Beach is about that station. It's telling that story. As I was doing the research for this nonfiction book, the people who staffed the station, notably the first keeper, Richard Etheridge, there was clearly this rich backstory. And we could get, my co-author and I could kind of get an outline of that story, but we couldn't quite pin it down because he had been a slave. So there were very few records, almost none. And even after the Civil War, after freedom, his life, even though he was this prominent figure of the Outer Banks community, and frankly, heroic, there was just very little documentation. That part of the story, that's what drew me to want to write the novel. Richard Etheridge very likely was, as Kent mentioned, the son of his master. That story was hugely interesting to me, and I thought that was something that I would want to explore in fiction if I had the opportunity. The other piece of it was his Civil War service. Could track it, like knew what unit he was in, found him actually a document with his name in it. One of the only personal documents we found was a letter he wrote during the Civil War. Could follow the unit, but couldn't really locate him specifically in it. He was a sergeant in a company that was very active. So the novel began in that way, as a way to sort of tell the parts of the story that I couldn't tell through nonfiction because I couldn't support them with documentation. But really the part of it was the slavery part. Was, if any of y'all, my guess is most of you have been down to the Outer Banks, it's this small isolated community. It was even more isolated then. Before they built bridges in the 1930s, you lived on the Outer Banks, you were more likely to have contact with passing mariners than you were with people from inland North Carolina. It was just hugely isolated. Fairly small. It's a long stretch of coast, but the entire population was about 2,000 people, and about a quarter of them were black. And so in the Outer Banks, in slavery in general, so-called miscegenation, blacks and whites having children, was hugely common. In the Outer Banks, it was common in specific ways that I thought interesting. Because if you are a slave master and you rape one of your slaves and have a child and you're on a big plantation, that's one thing. In the Outer Banks slaveholding, the biggest slaveholders had 8, 9 slaves. What does that look like when your child is in proximity to you all the time? The biggest sort of slaveholders worked alongside their slaves oftentimes. What did that look like? And that was part of the story that really drew me in, that made me want to try to, understand what it looked like. This was supposed to be a reading, so I'm going to quit talking now. But that's the novel that I thought I wrote. The novel that I was also interested in, again, the vehicle for telling that story, was this 3-week excursion when the African Brigade, in which Richard Etheridge was a sergeant, was first armed. And the first thing that they did, Edward Wilde, the most appropriately named general in the army, he takes those men who came from the Outer Banks, those former slaves, and they march back to where they had been enslaved. And the mission is specifically to free loved ones left behind. And that's an interesting story too. For me, that was the vehicle to then tell this other story. All right, enough preface. I'm going to read from the novel I thought I wrote first. It's a third or halfway through or into the book. Richard Etheridge, just as context, they're on this march back. Richard Etheridge, it's evening, he's thinking back, remembering his youth. Pups are likely to favor their paps as things go, of appearance and bearing, if not also of humor and brain. Such was the case with me and John B. John B. Etheridge was his master, his father. John B. never seemed to mind it, our shared resemblance, even when out together among white folk. This wasn't the speculation on my part, of course, for John B. did not speak of his feelings, or much all else for that matter. My man was of a different mind on the likenesses between my father and me, and I well understood the reason why. A constant reminder of one's suffering is no less suffered just because the bearer of the sad message is your beloved only child. But I could no more alter the dispositions, but I can no more alter my disposition or the facets of my face than change the color of my skin. And she and I had settled on a middle ground, unspoken but recognized. She would attempt to forestall casting sharp words or spiteful glares my way when I might inadvertently remind her of the man. And I tried my darndest not to do it, inadvertently or otherwise. I also forget that I'm old and I need glasses now. Our makeups have a mind of their own, and it was no small feat to control my very nature. I knew my man's feelings on John B. and on the Etheridge house. I respected them. What a boy will seek out his father. Lying sleepless between my lean-to, I found myself 13 again. A Sunday morning, early, well before sunrise. I slipped lightly into the chattel house behind the Midget Manor and stirred away first Fields, then Bill Charles, and bid them to join me. Neither much appreciated my creeping upon their palates at that hour, yet both followed after, with little goading or much need of convincing. We were friends true. It was our free day, made for sacking out as long as was possible, and tolerated before whatever chores would be compelled by mams and paps, then the weekly camp meeting after that. The three of us hauled one of John B.'s 15-yard seine nets over to the Croatan Sound. With Fields on one end and Bill Charles on the other, I managed the arc stretch in between. We dragged the shallows till the sun reached mid-morning height, camp meeting time, and brought in more speckles and red drum than we could carry. Fields and Bill Charles both took a share, precious bounty for families that never went unfed, but were never quite fed enough. As author of the idea, I was allotted the two biggest drums. Each was nigh as long as my thigh and all but as thick. Hooking a hand and a gill of each, I lugged them up to the Etheridge house. The fish were heavy, and it was a far hike. I passed through the kitchen, greeting Ma'am Dinah, who was dishing broth into a ceramic serving bowl. She tossed up a silent hand as hello, then returned to her work, paying me and my load little mind, as my presence hereabouts was regular and never unexpected. I pushed into the doorway to the dining room and stood there, eyes lowered. The family was at table after church, over at Roanoke Island Baptist, which John B.'s father, Adam, had built. John B. sat across from Mrs. Margie, Missy Sarah across from Patrick. Sarah saw me first. Hey there, Dick, what have you got? I've rung you a couple of drum, I said, raising my face. Brought you, Sarah corrected. I taught you better than that. I brought you a couple of drum, I said, and extended my arms toward the table, though each one ached and trembled from the exertion of the trek over. Patrick looked mightily impressed, but as he rose to inspect the catch, Mrs. Margie scolded, "Stay right where you are, Patrick. You are not dismissed." I said to John B., "I borrowed your nets for the venture and expect I owe you something for their use." There was a hint of a smile on John B.'s face. "You might ought to ask permission beforehand rather than assume that my nets are for public purpose," said he. "But I appreciate your honesty and the initiative. I wanted to show you what I can do when given the chance," said I, aiming for an assertive tone and not that of a question. "I'm becoming grown and thought maybe you'd give me a chance to run one of your fishing boats." Patrick jumped in. "Me and him could run it together, Uncle John," he added. "Of course I would supervise." "I've seen how you supervise Dick," said John B. "As for you, He turned back to me. You would do well to show a little less of these superior capabilities, lest I have you out bright and early every morning before your duties, catching our noontime meal. Mrs. Marjorie cleared her throat, though she maintained her focus plate-wise. Does it not worry you, John? An industrious servant with his own program and aims? And maybe also an axe to grind? The hint of a smile quit John B.'s face. Why should it? I've taught him his place. As I'm sure Goodman Turner up in Southampton County thought he had taught the nigger Nat his, said Mrs. Marjorie, moving carrot coins about with her fork. No one seemed to suspect that I understood the reference. I left my eyes low so as not to give away that I did. For raw spleen, John B. could match crossedness for crossedness. Dick will one day be to our darky community what we are to the sand banks. Etheridge stock always shows its pedigree. The strained muteness of the room portended the peril that might of a sudden befall me with this barbed turn. But I had noted my father's words. He'd spoken of me as pedigree. The silence stretched. Take them back to Mammy Dinah, I heard John B. say, his words still sharp, though directed at me and no longer at his wife. I slipped out of the room and left the drum on the kitchen counter and scooted out the door. Later that afternoon, Patty turned up at Mam's cabin. Hey, Dick, he hollered, calling me outside, boldly, but not too bold. Whatever he might be learning about his station as white folk, every blessed soul on the island was placed with my mother. I dragged myself to the door, and Patty waved me over. He scolded. Why didn't you tell me you boys were sailing today? I'd have joined you. It's Family Sunday, Patty, said I. Your place is over at Roanoke Island Baptist, then up to the house for dinner with the family. I'd meant the words to sting. He went on about being left out of the fun, as was his right. I demurred, but did not bow, as befit my blood, my pedigree. After he left, it was my man's turn to scold me. You got to carry whatever load he command you to, but not aught else. She wasn't talking about Patrick. She knew about the two big drums. Word travels fast on an island, especially amongst its color. He don't do for you, you do for him. You don't owe him one precious thing. My ma'am supposed that my attention towards John B. was a sign that I had no buck. I knew this, but it wasn't that, not ever. I had buck, and then some. No, it was because the man was my father. Those interested glances, chanced upon when John B. thought no one was noticing. In those moments, I recognized that I was being looked upon as the son. Even had I hated John B. as my master, as a man who'd made of my ma'am a concubine and not a beloved, some feelings are inborn. I could no more quash my draw to him and to his family, to my fascination with my pedigree, than John B. could conceal his curiosity about me, who was of his own blood. I told Ma'am, Master John B. said I got initiative and I got drive, and Mike can run one of his boats. I didn't expect her to feel the pride from this that I was feeling, but I knew she would recognize its useful implication. That'd be more catch and whatnot for you and me and for everybody. Mash, she said. His name Master? She awaited a reply. I offered none. Not in my eyes it ain't, she said, and not in my cabin. No, no, son. That word is not permitted here. Insolence wasn't ever my way, and so it was as though I was hearing some other self speak. May not be for you, but for us all else, it is. Pardon, she said. What did you say? I'd accomplished something with my sunrise venture, and John B.'s acknowledgement of it. That bore remarking. Me, the man of our household, and head in the making of the colored section. Me, Richard. For everybody else, I said, Mask be the man's first name. I couldn't help myself, I added. And he a pretty good one, too. I expect as masters go. Contrary words did not fluster my man. They brought forth her rage. Do you think because he let you hang about his house that he think you special? That you different? The silence that followed demanded that I raise my face. It defied me not to. I refused. You ain't sleeping in it though, is you? I responded then, my voice as soft as smoke. He taught me letters, not to no slave boy other, but just to me. It weren't John B. what taught you, but his daughter. All he did was not disallow it. She harumphed fiercely, but only so as to catch her breath. He allowed his daughter a pet to play with of a Sunday afternoon, a grinder's monkey on a leash. Her silence went gentle then, and I realized that it was because my cheeks were shining with wet. Ma'am didn't abide soft, but she sat in her sewing chair and pulled me into her lap. My body stretched almost as long as hers, yet I curled up small and sank into her breast. I'd never known my ma'am's true age, only that she'd born me when about as many years as I was then. She always seemed older. But curled up there, sobbing into her chest, I saw the beautiful girl she had once been. The face from my earliest memory, welcoming eyes, honey on a fingertip that I sucked at, hummed words that might be song or maybe just nonsense feather sounds. Making a baby don't make a father, she told me. Remember that. As soon as you start thinking elseways, you have forsook your own self. You gotta understand, he owned you, just like you had owned them dead drunk. I knew my man to be right, as sure as day begets night and night becomes day. But pups will favor their paps. I knew this too. A boy will seek out his father. So that was the novel I thought I was writing. And it's in there. I have to say, a lot of the conversations I've had in doing readings and things like that, it inevitably comes up in our conversations during the Q&A. I never read from that section of the novel, or only once, because I think that a lot of times the audience, and I'm not sure this is true of y'all, but the audiences I've read to or spoken to expect the other novel a little bit more, the Civil War novel. And I have to say, it was hugely fun to write, in part because the story is so rich. Just the idea of this 3-week foray back to where you had been enslaved to free not just any slaves, but slaves who you know and who you're related to, struck me as a rich idea. But as I was going through and doing the research, and there is a lot of research on Civil War, I just kept stumbling upon incident upon incident upon incident. Every time I think, okay, something needs to happen here, and I look back in the research and something happened. So I'm going to read from the first chapter, which was based on an actual incident that happened with this unit. And it was right as the troopers are armed, but before they take the forays. It's really their first venture out into the field, I think in part because Wilde wants to show his commanders who are resistant that they will be able to perform in the field. And also maybe himself just to gauge the degree to which that was true. So they're based here. It was called Fortress Monroe. They called it Fortress Freedom. And they set out towards right about where Virginia Beach is now. A reputed guerrilla leader had a plantation there. So the military base is here, but the surrounding land is still, plantations and slave owners and things like that. The sort of transition from freedom to slavery wasn't just sort of abrupt. Lincoln signs a decree and then suddenly everything has changed. So the African Brigade, this one company, Richard's company, Company C, is venturing out from Fortress Freedom to arrest this reputed Confederate guerrilla. It was an Indian summer morn. Yellowjacks, like we had out in the Sound Banks, rousing alongside the day's heat, petulant and unrelenting, lighting onto whatever skin lay exposed, your cheek, the nape of your neck. And like back home, they bit down to let you know that they'd stopped by, as though the buzzing at your ears hadn't already done that. Troopers swatted at the air despite Sergeant Revere's scornful gaze. I strove not to maintain the same air of authority. The distractions ceased as we parade marched past the Princess Anne Courthouse. Old Glory whipped back and forth on her staff atop the white stone building, though it was clear that she was begrudgingly flown. Our footfalls had the cadent boom of thunder. We'd hardly gone 200 paces past the courthouse when the Clapson farm appeared, across a stretch of unflowered and rustling stems where flax had not so long before been harvested. Cuffy, the runaway who'd given us the intelligence, figure pointed it out. General Wild raised the one good arm, and our column halted, the booming footfalls of a sudden still. Though nary a head turned, all eyes peeked as one over at that plantation house across the way that was our target. It was more facade than depth, boasting tall windows and stairs out front, but just dull planking on the sides, with little texture and no paint. A weatherboard barn stood to the left, a mess of chattel houses to the right. The general had yet to speak word the first. He turned his mount and trotted back down our line, casual-like. Coming abreast of each row, he seemed to take in each man. As he neared me, I noticed that a yellow jack, furry and full, had lit upon his face above the right eye. The man did not flinch as the deerfly did his due. Wild met my gaze full on. "No need fighting the inevitable," said he. "Let come what may, the pain cannot last." And he sauntered on. Some minutes later, I heard him spur his mount, and man and rider dashed back to the head of the company. He ordered us forward, Ox's squad on one flank, Revere's on the other, where the chattel houses were, and mine down the center, straight through the crackling flax. The three lines spanned a half circle around the main dwelling house. Slaves stirred. Some emerged from the barn to take a look-see, even more from the chattel houses, which weren't but shacks with uneven joints and unglassed slits for windows. Then, a man with disarranged hair and considerable whiskers appeared at the door of the main house. Clapson, for sure. For he carried himself as though proprietorship was his established due. He wore breeches and a long-sleeved undershirt, nothing more. His suspenders not yet raised over his shoulders, and he stepped out onto his broad porch and stared down the general, who'd ridden in front of him and not dismounted. Aught other moved. My squad being nearest, I had a box seat view when the general finally spoke. Edgar Clapson, he queried. "You know damn well it is," said the other. "I'm Edward Augustus Wild, Brigadier General Volunteers, commanding." He half turned in the saddle and offered with a flourish, "The African Brigade." We all just stood there at attention. "I see your nigger pogey," said Clapson, "and I do not recognize your authority." He hitched up the suspenders, an angry gesture, as though they too had vexed his peaceful waking. "I command the Tidewater 12th Home Guard, the Pungo Raiders, and this here is my property." Wild signaled with a nod. Sergeant Revere, who was nearby, flew up onto the porch in 2 quick strides and seized Clapson meanly by the shirt and by the nape. "Unhand me," said Clapson. 2 troopers joined Revere, and they forced the man down the steps and wrestled him to his knees beneath the general's gaze. "Pogies, sir?" Wild said. "Did you say pogies?" Clapson would not respond, so General Wild continued. These men are Armageddon's agents, both Gog and Magog. Your world is no more." He turned toward us, the rest of the company. His voice boomed. "Guerrillas are cowards and murderers without honor, no better than land pirates, and their fate is either quarantine or death. This land pirate's property is hereby confiscated. Seize all men, women, and tykes. Seize the grains and any implements and tools. Fill every hogshead, fill every buckle. It is all contraband, and it returns with us." I broke the men into teams and sent this one toward the barn and that one toward the chattel houses where slaves were still falling out. And what had been puzzlement and gloom now turned to pure rejoicing. I could not know whether my own face showed it, but I was much overjoyed too. I was directing some men loading a handcart with farm tools when I overheard the runaway Cuffy saying to the general, all slavers but they slaves. His head was bowed, but his voice clear and strong. But this one, he in the habit of stripping him head to heels, gals as likely as men's, whatever the age and for the least offense, and he lay it on sportly. The general's expression did not change, but something was moving underneath. I know of at least one that ain't survived it, said Cuffy. And I noted then what aforehand I had failed to see, a whipping post, well used, standing erect between the dwelling house and the barn. Or, what was more likely, my eyes had until then dodged seeing it. I had never suffered the lash, but what slave did not know it? General Wild, come abreast of Clapson, still disdainful of dismounting, leaned low from his saddle. Even the women, said he? Even the women? Revere yanked Clapson to his feet, unbidden by the general, but the order clear. The Secesh pulled like a colt then, no one certain what was next. Revere, with a fistful of hair and a fistful of cloth, dragged him toward that upright timber. Shackles hung from its foretop point, and while two troopers wrestled the man's lurching and writhing, Revere hitched him on by the wrists. The yard was dead still, us colored, slave as well as soldier, watching on. Mrs. Clapson's mouth lay wide open, lips a quiver, but no sound came forth. Their three little boys, though, each one wailed. The general marched his mount to the barn and into it, then returned with a bullwhip over the pommel of his saddle. He rode it over to Revere. Clapson yanked at his wrists, crying to be released, all plea and no protest now. Pungo Raiders, said the general. How quaint. And with this, Revere, again obliging some unspoken command, lit the air with that long leather hide. Once, and again. Fields Mitchell was then beside him, and I had not heard him come up. Damn, Richard, he said. Damn. It was neither pity nor pleasure in his voice, just blunt astonishment. For who among us could imagine this? The bottom rail on top, a nigger flogging a legal white man. The general bid Revere stop just 4 lashes along. Clapson's head slumped low, his lips whimpering curses. The general prepared to address us troopers gathered around, or so we initially thought. In fact, he was speaking at the mothers. Ladies, said he, his voice musical with sympathetic timbre, I won't ask that you disclose this man's blasphemies against your virtues. Instead, I present the chance to settle old scores. The yard stood still. Even Clapson's sons had ceased to wail. From the crowd emerged an old mammy, head wrapped in a red rag, cheekbones like straight razors, a burlap dress hanging as long and plump as her own long self. She crossed to the post, a deliberate stride that made the 30-odd paces seem a damn sight more distant. When she got there, she unfastened a tie and the topmost burlap dropped to the waist. Dugs as flat as griddle cakes lay like sad folds of flesh against her chest. It didn't seem she retained a tooth in her head. This here the only virtue of being a Clapson nigger, said she, her voice gravel and as purposeful as her movements. She turned, and her back was a tangle of fleshy welts. Ain't aught left here to blaspheme, but I expect I might take you up on that score in a bit. Mass Clapson come up is long due. The general took the coil of cowhide from Revere and handed it to the old mammy. She let it out along the ground, reckoning the proper distance. Once she'd settled onto the right spot, the cowhide sang. And then I heard the rest, the other slaves cheering, troopers too. I heard Mrs. Clapson's rejoined wailing, her children's, and the rebel Clapson begging, mercy, Jenny, oh mercy. Vengeance can be justice, well earned and meted out fairly, and yet it be vengeance all the same. The cowhide sang. I'll stop there. questions or just have a conversation. Yeah.
Apparently, I'm just phrasing it, I don't know. But, I'm first of all, I apologize for being a little late. I haven't been in the area long. Creative nonfiction is what I believe is your specialty for this genre of literature. I was first introduced to it 16 years ago. And I have a better understanding thanks to your work.
Well, thank you.
I was never good at making things up. I was better at speculating as to how it may have been, or might have been, if you will. First of all, I want to thank you, because I know which books I'm going to write now.
Well, thanks.
And the question I have, what gave you the courage to pursue such uncharted territory? That would be my specific question, because when we get into speculation, I know exactly how this works, because in my mind, I see something and I say, this person changed it, because if you look at it today, it's nothing like it was. You know, and I'll say little about that, because that's the project I'm working on. But what gave you the courage to do this? Because we've seen the other, well, this is what happened. We've seen the, this is what could have happened. We've seen the, what if this happened? But this is more of a, and I'm new to that, just factual, haven't really dug in on that. But I imagine it's based on what I've seen. This is what I perceive would have happened and why. But what gave you the courage to do that? Because, yeah.
Well, I appreciate it.
David, I want to go ahead and repeat her question so that our streaming audience can hear it, which is that she asked a really beautiful question about when you're doing this work at the intersection of sort of research and imagination, what is and what could be, what gave you the courage to undertake that work?
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to answer the question in two parts. And the first part really short. In part because you use the word courage, and I appreciate it, but a part of me feels like this is just what we do. Like we want to write, and this is just what we do. And then the task becomes to do it well. Some days, you know, you read what you wrote, or you get some response that humbles you, and you realize, yeah, you know, maybe I chose the wrong path. But generally, no. I mean, we start doing it, and you keep doing it, and you end up doing it better. The other part of your question, though, about and the way you phrase it, I'm probably going to say it back at you poorly, but as a writer, I find myself very much in a similar place, which is to say, I don't know that, like, I just imagine these stories, and I mean, I've written a few that just sort of was like, ooh, wouldn't this be interesting? But generally, I'm drawn to historical writing in part because the story is there. The thing that is also there, though, that I think makes me feel like I can tell those stories is, at heart, those are people like me and you, right? Context is different. 100 years ago it was different. 150 years ago was interesting to me in a number of ways. We were talking at lunch. I'd love to read histories in part because sometimes you're just astounded how little has changed. And other times, it's amazing the movement we've made. But at heart, fiction, I write both fiction and nonfiction, but at heart, fiction, for me, fiction writing is about character, right? It's about understanding these people that you imagine or that you read about and you're creating in this world, and imagining them true. And so having Richard Etheridge, knowing the man he became from documents, and having some sense of who he had been before that led to there, the slave, the person born in slavery, who didn't have to join the Union Army at that point, right? He is free. The Union Army had arrived in the Outer Banks, yet he chooses to do that. He is it's clear from some of the later documents that he was fairly well treated as a slave. I mean, I say fairly, but fairly well treated as a slave. And yet he still felt this compulsion to go and do this thing, where he's going to fight and assert himself. That says some interesting things about who he was as a character. I imagined a confrontation with his cousin Patrick, who's like a brother, in part because it was a substitute for that confrontation with his father. What does that look like? You know, that's a very human thing. One last thing, and I think it's an answer to your question. This is the other problem I have. I mean, there are many, but I tend to ramble, and I also do this. Like, poor Henry, who drove me from the airport last night, I chewed his ear to 15 minutes, and I think we talked about 20 different things, and it was me doing all the talking. But an excerpt of this came out in the New Yorker a couple of years ago. And I was just flattered and honored on the one hand. I'd never been in the magazine, but they do these interviews afterwards. And the editor who was interviewing me pressed elation. We're talking about Fire on the Beach and the history, the backstory of the history, talking about the story. It was a little bit what I read there. And then at a certain point, she knew a little bit about my own backstory. Which is to say, I have a really complicated paternity. The man who I thought was my father turned out wasn't my father, and she made reference to that. And I realized in that moment that when I'm writing about Richard Etheridge and his conflict of paternity, I'm kind of writing about me too, right? And my own sort of. So it's about character, but it's also something fundamentally about the self that maybe we're trying to get at. That was a long, serpentine answer. I apologize.
No, that's the way I am too. So I followed it perfectly.
Maybe just you and me, though.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Henry. I couldn't see it.
Sorry. Actually, David, the end of that question and bringing up the piece that you just wrote from the New Yorker, you actually presuppose what I was going to ask you about, which is that like there does seem to be like a lot of thematic resonance between like, especially what you selected as what the novel that you thought you wrote, which is essentially about this like father-son relationship, but also like the son-mother relationship and the mother-father relationship, and that sort of like weird triangle between them. And it seems to map like thematically very well onto a piece that you're now a non-fiction piece about your own life. You're writing multiple decades afterwards, I guess.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you would like kind of expand on kind of the end of your answer there and just kind of like talk about that relationship and how it's like runs through the work.
Yeah, so for folks joining us on screen, Henry just asked a question about the resonances between the novel that David just read from and a nonfiction piece that he has been working on recently, now decades later, and talking about the ways that the resonances in terms of the way that he writes about relationships are featuring across both pieces and throughout his work.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. So just a little context, the essay that Henry's referring to came out just recently. And as I mentioned, my mother was, I didn't mention this, but I began to mention the context of my own paternity. My mother was a French Jew who survived the war. She was born in 1931. And then after the war, sort of, outraged, I think is probably the best word, and rebellious, she sort of gravitated towards anything that wasn't French. And she had a really conflicted relationship with her Jewishness, I think, for all those complicated reasons. But so she embraced the anti-colonial movement. And she was with sort of Africans from colonial West Africa, blah, blah, blah. She fell in love with one of those African men. And, they're also just kids. And so they do what kids do, and he cheated on her, and she cheated on him, and they have this falling out. She ends up marrying very impulsively a black GI in the wake of that, and they came to the United States. Fast forward, 5 or 6 years, they're back in France because de Gaulle had kicked out the French, and Jack Wright, the man that she married, tall, handsome man, a little bit of a player, maybe even a lot of a player, and she reconnects with her first love. My big sister's already born, and 9 months later, me. But nobody knew. She kept it very much a secret. Her mother knew, and her dearest friend. So again, fast forward, we come back to the United States. Jack Wright and my mother are divorced. She remarries another man. We sort of moved around, very peripatetic upbringing. But when I was 16, she told me. And in telling me then, I started trying to figure out then these various fathers and roles they played in my life. And, I grew up small town West Texas, I say, much more Friday Night Lights than Mouse, it was just sort of, it was just sort of that kind of upbringing, And so to Henry's question, again, until Cressida pointed it out, it was really like an aha moment. As much as I've been thinking about Richard Etheridge, I've been thinking about Richard Etheridge and working on Richard Etheridge since 1992. That's when Zoe and I we were grad students like many of y'all. And we were looking for, it was like fall term, first year of grad school. And like towards the end of that first year when you're kind of frustrated and a little bit anxious, but also a little angry or overworked, you're not paid enough, blah, blah, blah. And we were at a grad student party, and I hope I don't offend anybody, sometimes I do, and just by myself. But somebody pulled out a guitar, which is what happens at grad student parties, and is strumming the guitar, and Zoe and I are sort of verklempt on the other part of the room, just wishing that life was easier. And he asked if I knew about the Piano Life Saving Station, because he saw on this photograph. All that is a way to say, since that moment in 1992, we thought we were writing something for grad school. It grows into an article that grows into a book. And I always thought I was really thinking about Richard Etheridge in a different way. And until Cressida asked that question, making the connection, it didn't occur to me that I'm drawn to Richard Etheridge also because of that conflicted fraternity. But I have to say the other part that draws me to Richard Etheridge that was more apparent, which I think it doesn't directly answer your question, Henry, but for me it does. I'm not trying to be able to overlay the two. So I'm biracial, French Jew, Black American, also it turns out Black African, mixed it. And to me, that's what Americanness is. That's been plain for a long time. But Americanness is about mixedness. It's also about this really deliberate effort by the mainstream to deny this, to not recognize it, to not even see it. But you think about it. An example I use, I teach a course called Race and Gender and Class and Representation from Twain to Hurston, from the Reconstruction through the Harlem Renaissance. And one of the keystone pieces we use is ragtime, Scott Joplin. And y'all know what ragtime is? Yeah. 1890s, 1900, ragtime is this hugely popular musical form throughout the world. And it really puts American culture in the public eye in a really specific way, which is to say, until then, American art and culture had an eye towards England, what was recognized as American art and culture. Mark Twain is important in a way because he pushes against this too, right? By giving Huck Twain this voice that's really distinctive. But the sort of high art in America looks like, or wants to look like high art in Great Britain, in England. But ragtime in the world, people are like, this is distinctive. This could have come from no place else. This is uniquely American. And in retrospect, we often look back at it. Ragtime becomes jazz, becomes the blues and everything else, rock and roll and everything else it becomes. But at heart with ragtime, we want to look back and go, that's black music. And there's a lot of truth in it, but that's not the exact truth. Scott Joplin, the sort of foremost ragtime artist, was classically trained. Ragtime was low art, right? It started in brothels. It started in brothels in the black community, a lot in New Orleans. And so it's associated with black culture because they assume, mainstream culture assumes black culture inferior in that way, more licentious and whatnot. But what people are recognizing in the world is that it's African rhythms, but on a European instrument, right? The piano, which is ragtime music, is European. That marriage of culture that people are seeing as fundamentally American is mixed, right? And that mixedness is the thing that interests me. So when I understand that Richard Etheridge is probably his master's son, it's interesting to me in that way. I thought I might be able to lay it over the top and make these questions come together. I'm not sure I can. But I did want to get that in there in part because the new thing I'm working on is called Mixed It. And so it's personal that it's a memoir. But when I learned I'm the descendant of, it turns out that my African father was the descendant of slave trading kings. The last king, the woman warrior, that king in there, the really beautiful man, that's my great-great-grandfather. and I wish I looked like him. That culture, that slave trading culture, society is a better way to put it. That slave trading society are who my forebears are. I thought I was a descendant of slaves. It turns out I'm a descendant of slave traders. And overlay on that, a Holocaust survivor, right? Romanian Jews who live in France. When I learned all this, I never felt less American, right? Americanness is something else. I'll just leave it at that. I'm starting to ramble. Sorry. Oh, yeah, hand shot. We'll go the row behind and then you.
Okay,
So,
all right.
I was going to ask what drew you to the North of Virginia and North Carolina area, but you did answer that a bit. So I'm curious about if you found any other posts like the one in the Outer Banks where they were like manned by Black people in particular, like in your research, do you find any similar stories or some experiences like that?
I've stumbled across a lot of similar stories.
David,
sorry.
you reiterate that for
Okay.
our audience before you go. I just want to make sure that the internet can hear you also.
You reiterate much better than me. I started thinking about the answer. If you don't mind, do you mind?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So you were asking, Tope, rephrase your question for me one more time, slightly more loudly.
Okay, I was curious about what drew you to the North Carolina, Virginia area, but he sort of answered that with his personal story. So I'm curious about if we found similar stories like with Richard Etheridge, like places that were manned strictly by Black people.
Yeah, she had initially been interested in what drew you to the region, but then she's also interested in, did you find other similar stories when you went looking?
Yeah, the first part I did, I'll just say one thing more, which is to say, I lived abroad after undergrad. Before I started the MFA, I was gone for 6 years or so. And when I came back to do my MFA, I was first up the way in Richmond, that first year of grad school that I made reference to. And when Zobi, the cover of Fire on the Beach is this picture of this all-Black crew. Zobi grew up here. He grew up in Newport News. And he'd been to the Outer Banks his whole life and never knew about them. So he asked me, did I know anything about them? I'm saying all that as a way to say, at that point, I'm in Richmond. I didn't even know what the Outer Banks were. You know, we were like 150 miles away or something. I couldn't have pointed it out on a map. So it was really happenstance. It was really happenstance that I ended up here. And because the stories are so rich, I think as writers, some of what we do, whether it's nonfiction or poetry or fiction or whatever, we're looking for that good, interesting story, the vehicle that's going to help us tell the thing we need to say, or just a good story to tell. And hereabouts, there are just so many great stories, especially for my interests, like I said, which tend to be historical and much to do with race in America. Just as a simple or a side point, I read this fact in so in 1865, at the end of the Civil War, 80% of all Black people in America are in Virginia. It's a huge number, right? In part because the earliest colony, in part because of the origins of slavery, but also once the Civil War breaks out, the Union makes its first toehold here, slaves are freeing from North Carolina and nearby and ending up here. So I'm saying that as a way to say there are just these rich stories. I stumbled on a lot of them. Some told or beginning to be told, but they're all out there. The fact that they have not been reported doesn't mean they don't exist. It just means that until fairly recently, there hasn't been what we're trying to do as writers, I think, is find this audience and for mainstream houses. Until Terry McMillan, they thought Black people didn't read, right? Waiting to Exhale, they thought Terry McMillan actually doesn't create a market, but recognizes a market. So I feel like those stories, even The Woman King, that story's been out there forever, but no movie's being made. So yeah, I'm not sure I answered your question. I hope I did.
All right, and Will, I think you have our final question of the evening.
I'm gonna make it really good. Is it a weird feeling when you write a book and your readers tell you that you've written a different book?
Sorry.
So Will asks, in reference to David's comment earlier in the evening, he asks if it's a weird feeling to write a book and then have your readers tell you that you've written, in fact, a different book than the book you thought you wrote.
That's a great question. It is weird, and there's something kind of awesome about it. I mean, it isn't so far off. I knew this is set in the Civil War, and I knew that this was catchy. Ken and I we're at the same publishing house, and my editor, I mean, I had a sense of this before it happened, because my editor, when he would describe to me the novel, and he's giving notes and things like that, I had a sense of it. It was really when I started reading reviews, I was like, oh, okay. And again, it didn't hurt my feelings, but the thing the weird part of it is, I wonder if the part that I wrote, that I thought I was writing, the backstory, that exploration of sort of conflicted paternity, his relationship with the community, I wonder the degree to which that part resonates. And I don't know. I mentioned the only other time I haven't read from the second part I read. I read the early pages, which are also flashback, and it's Richard and Patrick, and they're on the beach, and he sees his father and recognizes him as his father. It's that whole other piece of it. And I read that at this event up in Vermont. Yeah, Vermont. And afterwards, a woman came up who had read the novel. She told me, "You read the wrong part." That's not what it is. And I was like, so I don't know. You know, that part is weird. I think it works, but does it resonate? Does it matter? At the end of the day, I just feel lucky to have a book out in the world, and it seems to be working a little bit on some level. So.
I can't think of a lovelier sentiment to end on than that. So thank you all for
Thank you all.
The wonderful folks at the University Bookstore are selling copies of David's book down front. He might even be nice enough to sign one for you. And I hope that we will see many of you back here at 4 p.m. tomorrow for our next Wish Best event, which is the Reading with the Poet Sarah Mathis. Thank you again, David.